Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf kaf bet. Today's daf is sponsored in memory of Dina Cocker's grandmother, Tzipora Shoshana Bar Bracha Zichrono Lebracha. May her memory be a comfort and a blessing. Today's daf is sponsored by Becky Goldstein for the refuah shlema of David Mordechai ben Rezel, who is undergoing a procedure this morning. Please God for a successful operation with Shlichim Ne'emanim. Okay, we're going to get started with where we ended yesterday with this braita of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Today we're going to finish the second chapter. And there's also a study guide for today, which I recommend you use just to help organize. I'm not going to share screen. It's not like it's one of those necessary ones, but it does just organize the flow of the Gemara. So Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar had said, Lo yaskir adam sadehu lekuti. You can't rent out your field to a kuti. Remember, those are the shomernim. There were people who took upon themselves to be Jews. So it was a bit of a debate about them, whether it was wholehearted, not wholehearted, whether they're real converts, they're not real converts. But what was basically known about them is, even though they kept certain mitzvot, there were certain things they were known not to have been so careful about. And one of them we saw yesterday was doing malacha on Chol HaMoed. So basically, what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says is that you can't rent out your field to a kuti because your field is in your name, and the kuti is going to do malacha on Chol HaMoed. And people will say, oh, look, the Jews' field is working on Chol HaMoed, which will make people, it will look like Marit Ayin. It'll look like Jews are doing work on Chol HaMoed. But then the assumption is he specifically said kuti. He didn't say not a non-Jew. So I'm just starting from the second to last line in Kafala from a bet. So what? It sounds like Ovei Kochavim is permitted, but why? Now, why did we in general? Now, we already permitted renting out your field to a Gentile, because what did we say? No one's going to say, oh, it's the Jew's field because that's working on, and it's the Jew who's allowing work on Shabbat on the field, because the way it works with fields, and we had that whole thing about in Tosfot that we learned yesterday, the way it works with field is arisa, arisute avid. Everybody knows that sharecroppers are the ones working, and they're the ones who are basically making their proceeds from the field. And if they decide to do their work on Shabbat, so they do. No, doesn't mean the Jew. Everyone knows that's a sharecropper working. And they won't say, oh, the Jew's allowing work on Shabbat in their field and that the Jew's doing work. That the person's working for the Jew on Shabbat. It doesn't look that way because it looks like the Arisa is working for his or her own sake. But if that's your claim, it should be the same for the kuti. And that's where we ended. Why don't we say the same thing about the kuti? That the kuti is the aris. They won't accuse the Jew, and it won't be a maradayim problem of the way it looks, because it's the kuti. And everyone will say, oh, the kuti, well, they work. Now, the issue here is Chol HaMoed. They work on Chol HaMoed. No one's going to say, oh, look, the Jew's allowing work on Chol HaMoed. They'll say the kuti's doing it for the kuti's own sake. Okay, so in order to answer this, what they have to do is they have to say that this opinion, notice it was Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Arisuta, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, lately. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar must not accept this whole claim of Arisuta. Okay? He doesn't think that that is a valid answer, because if it was, it would work for the kuti. Now, what are we left to figure out then? Well, then why does he say only a kuti? What about the Gentile? Why are we allowed to rent out our field to a Gentile, but not to a kuti? And we're going to come up with a very interesting answer. My time a mutal. So why is it permitted? Because if you rent out your field to a Gentile, you can tell the Gentile, listen, I'll rent out my field to you. Okay, you can be a sharecropper in my field. But you have to know that if you're working in my field, you can't work on Shabbat, you can't work on Chol HaMoed, you can't work on all the holidays, you just can't work those days. And the Gentile will listen, right? For all the things we've been talking about, the Gentiles this, the Gentiles that, here you see that they're saying, the Gentiles will actually respect you for it. They'll say, okay, I know I'm going into this not being able to work on your field on certain days. Okay. Well, now the obvious question is, why wouldn't the kuti do that? Kuti, nami amrina levitziet. Why? If you're going to tell the Gentile and they're going to listen, wouldn't you think the kuti will listen also? No, kuti lo tziet, and here's a really interesting distinction. Da amar, he's not going to listen to you. Da amar, he'll say, Ana gemir nat feminach. I know better than you. I know that malacha is permitted on Chol HaMoed. You think it's not? I think it is. And I disagree with you. And therefore, I'm not going to not work on Chol HaMoed. This is your classic, right? I know better than you. And it's your classic someone from the outside is likely going to have more respect for your religious practices than someone from the inside who disagrees with your religious practices on principle. And that's a very interesting answer that the Gemara brings. And again, all of a sudden, the Gentiles are put in a much more positive light. Now, I just want to point out, and this might help us with some of the other negative light explanations we brought on the positive. Sometimes it's not that they're all this way, and it's not they're all right. It's the Gemara is concerned for a certain percentage of people that might be like this. I mean, wait till we get to the next Mishna and we talk about how the Gentiles are suspect that they're engaging in bestiality. What percentage of the population, we have no idea. But maybe because of a small percentage, you have to worry about it. Just like all the Mishnayot about in Ketubot, in the beginning of Ketubot, about believing people or not. Will you believe them if she says, I was a virgin. He said she wasn't. Who do we believe? It's not that most people use this. Most people get married and all is fine and they don't all start suspecting each other. Oh, you weren't a virgin from before, and they lie and they this. But the system has to be concerned for a certain small percentage that might be doing this. Okay, or right, like here, we're saying actually most of them will likely listen to you. The Kutim maybe won't. So sometimes we're also just trying to answer difficulties. We have, here we have this problem. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, doesn't make sense. How are we going to answer it? We come up with an answer. Again, whether all these things are accurate or not, right? The Gemara, that's the way the Gemara works. They're trying to come up with explanations that could possibly fit. Doesn't mean this is true always. It doesn't mean, right? And it doesn't mean the majority. It could be just they're coming up with possible explanations. They're all exploring possibilities. So in the world of exploring possibilities, they might say things in all directions. Okay, anyway, it's a very interesting answer given, and it is something you see, right? That it's definitely a reality that it's sometimes easier to tell someone who's from the outside and they'll respect you from it than someone from the inside. So now the Gemara has another question based on that. If the whole concern is, right, that the kuti, you can't give it to a kuti because the kuti is going to do malacha on Chol Moed. Well, there should be a bigger problem. It's not just ihachi. It's not just that people are going to say, oh, look, the Jews' field is being worked on Chol Moed. If the kuti does work on Chol Moed and you don't, and you give him a field that now the kuti can work on can work on Chol Moed, then you're basically putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person because you know that they're going to now work in a field on Chol Moed and you've given them the opportunity to do that. To which and then therefore, why did Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar specifically say Mipnei shenikret al shmo? He should have said because of lifnei iver lo titei mechshol. To which the answer chad ve'od kamar, but it's one and another. In other words, chad mishum lifnei iver ve'od mishum shenikret al shmo. This is sometimes they don't even state the obvious. The obvious is it's lifnei iver. What they wanted to say is, in addition, you have this problem that the field is in your name and it's going to make it look like you're doing work on Chol Moed. Okay, now we're going to end this chapter with a story. We're going to have two versions of the story and then something that's not going to become clear from this braita we're going to bring and a question on that. With that, we'll finish the first chapter. Hanu Morikai, there were saffron workers. This is version 1 of the story. De'ovei kochavim naki b'shabta. V'Yisrael b'cha b'shabta. So they made this arrangement that the Gentile will do the work. These were saffron workers in the field. The Gentile, they were arisim, sharecroppers. The Gentile will work on Shabbos, take the proceeds from Shabbat, and Yisrael b'cha b'shabta, and the Jew will work on Sunday. And that way, the Jew won't get any benefit from anything done on Shabbat. Atu l'kamei de Rabba. So they went in front of Rabba and asked, is this arrangement okay? Sharalahu, he said, no problem, you can do this. Eitive Ravina l'Rava. Ravina comes over to Rabba and says, what are you talking about? Look at this braita. This braita contradicts what you're ruling. Yisrael v'ovei kochavim shekiblu sadeh b'shutafut. If a Jew and a Gentile accept the field, meaning accept to be arisim, like kablanut and arisut are usually the same, they accept to be sharecroppers in a field together. Okay, now it sounds like they accepted it, right? They accepted together to be, both on this field. Lo yomar Yisrael ovei kochavim tol kacha b'Shabbat ani b'chol. The Jew can't say to the Gentile, look, you take your portion on Shabbat, and I'll take my portion on the weekdays. Okay, again, meaning you'll work on Shabbat and take the proceeds on Shabbat, and I'll work on Shabbat and take the proceeds. Sounds like exactly our story. However, but if they made an arrangement from the beginning that they would do it like this before they started, but the whole arrangement was all set from the beginning. You're going to work on Shabbat. I'm going to work on the weekday. That works. But if they're they did a cheshbon, meaning if after ba'u lecheshbon they didn't make an arrangement, but then they start saying, okay, let's divide up and let's do it like this, it's too late. It has to be done from the beginning. So what happens? After Ravina brought this difficulty to Rava realized he made a mistake. Ikasiv. He became humiliated, right? It was embarrassing. Here he ruled this was totally permitted. Ravina brought this source that said it's forbidden, and Rava was embarrassed. However, l'sofi gali milta dehitnumi karhavu. We've had a bunch of stories like this, by the way, where somebody does a ruling, somebody questions the ruling, they're humiliated, and then they realize that they were right in the end. Okay, that their psak ended up being right, even though they didn't realize it at the time. In other words, we're going to see right now. Turns out this was he hadn't realized, but it turns out maybe once the source was brought and then Rav started to look into it more, he realized that they had actually made the arrangement from the beginning, and therefore it was permitted. Okay, that's version 1. Now we have version 2. Rav Gavia mibek til. Okay, so a different person, Rav Gavia, came and said, Amar hanu shtile de or lahavu. Okay, you got the story wrong. It wasn't these saffron workers. It was people who planted orla trees. And ovei chabim achil shnei de orla, the Israel shnei de atera. Sorry, I shouldn't say they planted orla trees. They planted trees. And the issue related to orla, what's orla? The first 3 years, you can't benefit from the trees. So what did they do? They made an arrangement. In other words, again, they were sharecroppers in a field that they were planting these trees. And they made an arrangement that the ovei kochavim achil shnei de orla, the Gentile will work the first 3 years and take the proceeds. The Israel shnei de atera, and the Jew will work after that in the other years and get the proceeds. Atu the kamei de Rava sharelahu. Rava, they came before Rava and he permitted it. Now in this case, they made the arrangement from the beginning and he permitted it. So now they say, wait, if there's 2 versions of the story, and that was Rav Gavia's story, kind of ends early. If you see on the study guide, I charted it out so you could see what's similar, what's different. So what's similar is we have these workers, there was an arrangement, there was a psak of Rava, and Rava permitted in both cases. Now the question is, what happens after that? What happened to we're assuming if there was a story that went like this, there must have been also the difficulty of Ravina and Rava. What happened to that in this version? Otve Ravina la Rava. But according to the first version, Ravina brought a difficulty on Rava from this braita. Where's that in your version? To which he answers, the Sei'u. Oh, he brought the braita, but he brought the braita as support for what Rava did, because in this case, the arrangement was made from the beginning, and he was bringing the braita to say, oh, look, here's a braita to support your ruling. V'ha'ichzif, what happened to the humiliation then? The Rava wouldn't be humiliated. So what about that in your story? To which he answers, lo hayu dvarim me'olam. Oh, that part of the story, that never happened. In my version, there is no such thing. Okay, now we get to a question about this. Ibayalu. So now they ask a question. Stama mai. What if they didn't make any sort of arrangement at all? And it just sort of happened, because it makes sense that it happened, that the Jew worked during the week, during the weekdays, some of the weekdays, not on Shabbat, and the Gentile worked on Shabbat, and the Gentile took the proceeds from Shabbat, and the Jew took the proceeds from during the week. They never made an arrangement. They never talked about it. It's not like they didn't do this arrangement from the beginning. They also didn't start doing, okay, let's calculate, you get the Shabbat, I get the Sunday, what if it was just kind of in the middle? Now, if you look back at that braita, the braita said, if they made an arrangement from the beginning, it's permitted. If they did some sort of calculation after the arrangement was made and they start calculating, you do this, so you get that, and I'll get that, you can't. But what about if you just didn't say anything and you just quietly, I took my stuff, you took your stuff, we just did it like that, and sort of naturally, I would say. So now the Gemara wants to know, what's the story? Tashma, well, let's learn it from the braita. What did it say? If they made the arrangement from the beginning, it's permitted. It sounds like if they didn't make any arrangement, it's forbidden, right? Hastama would be asul. To which the Gemara says that's not a good proof, because ema seifa. The end of that line says, They specifically started calculating and dividing up. It's forbidden. Sounds like hastama mutal. This is a classic problem because they gave two extremes. They didn't give the middle position. So what if it's neither extreme? And they basically answer, you can't infer from there because from the first phrase, you would infer it would be asur. From the second phrase, you would infer it would be permitted. So we actually don't have a way to infer from here, and we're left with a question. And with that, Hadran alach lifnei yedehem, we finished the first chapter. Now we're going to move on to the next chapter. Topic is a little more complicated, not in terms of content, but not in terms of the flow of the Gemara, but it's complicated in terms of it's a topic that we have trouble relating to. It's about bestiality and concerns. We've actually seen this before. Concerns that Gentiles, the pagans, were engaging in bestiality, which is hard for us to understand. The Meiri already says this doesn't happen anymore, and we don't have to now. There are rare cases where this does happen, but it's not common anymore like it was, and we don't have to worry about these issues at all. And he basically, in classic Meiri style, as we've seen before with in general these Ovdei Kochavim, these pagan sugyas, he basically says, these pagans are pagans. They're not Gentiles. They're not non-Jews. We don't have to relate to, right? All these halachot are no longer relevant for the most part. And the whole treatment of Gentiles, he basically says this isn't relevant anymore because they were really talking about these idol worshippers. And I've said this bunch of times because it really was striking to me. The last time we were learning this, there was a woman at our table, Ani Schiffmiller, and she is a tour guide. And she said, because we were saying, did they really do this? And she said that she was reading a book at the time about the Romans and the culture then. And she said they were steeped in these kind of behaviors. It was very common, the orgies and the bestiality. It was very common. So you have to read these sugyas with kind of different glasses on and understanding that this really was a concern. Now, again, how much of the population? We still have no idea. Was it 20%? Was it 80%? There's no way to know. But even if it was 20%, you could see other rabbis wanted to be concerned for that 20%. So the Gemara, the Mishna says, we actually quoted this earlier. If you go to an inn at night, you can't leave your animal, put it alone in a room with a Gentile because we're worried that they're going to engage in bestiality. And what's the problem for me if my animal engages in bestiality? Well, first of all, there's an issue. I can't use it as a korban. That's a separate issue. That's not really what we're concerned about. If I want to bring that animal to sacrifice, can't bring an animal that engaged in bestiality. It's going to come up very soon. So I may as well tell you now. But the real issue here is not that because, so I don't use my animal for a sacrifice. That's not the problem. The problem is lifnei iver lo titei mechshol. I'm basically causing someone to do a sin. And even though they're a Gentile, we care about Gentiles doing sins. They're b'nei Noach. They're not allowed to do this. And therefore, I have to be careful not to create a situation where I might enable them to do that. And a woman shouldn't go alone into a room with one of these Gentiles because there's a concern of arayot. And this goes back to some things we saw also. They were very worried that the Gentiles were going to kill them. Again, how many of the Gentiles in those days were killing Jews? We don't really know. But obviously somebody was concerned for this possibility, and therefore even a man shouldn't go into a room alone with a Gentile because there's concern. There's no one else around. The Gentile might kill the Jew. Now, again, was there really, was this really a concern? It's definitely possible in certain situations, right, that there was possibility. But how much, right? How, again, percentage? I think 20% would be high, right? But obviously it was enough of a concern that they did put this in here. Now the Gemara starts off with a contradiction. Urimini. Lokchim mehem behema lekorban ve'en choshashim lo mishum mirba ve'lo mishum nirba ve'lo mishum muktzah ve'lo mishum ne'abad. Okay, muktzah here, by the way, doesn't mean muktzah the way we usually think of muktzah. The word muktzah means designated. And what it means here, muktzah means if an animal was designated to be used as an idol. Or ne'abad is the animal was worshipped as an idol. Okay, so at the beginning of Amud here, the Gemara brings a contradiction. It says, our Mishnah is worried about animals being, if I give an animal to a Gentile, put them alone in a room, it's likely the Gentile will engage in bestiality with the animal. But this source basically says, I can buy, and we get back to the sacrifice, I can buy an animal for sacrificial purposes from a Gentile, That's lokchim mehem. I can buy from them. Behema lekorban. And ein chosheshim, I'm not worried, not because of rovea, not because of nirba. Okay, rovea, right? Rovea and nirba is the same action. It's just one is initiated by the person, one is initiated by the animal. Okay, rovea is the animal engages the human in bestiality, and nirba is the human engaged the animal in bestiality. I don't have to worry because again, an animal, these four types, rovea, nirba, muktzah, nebad. Okay, whether it was used for idol worship purposes, makes a lot of sense. Can't use that as a sacrifice. And whether it engaged in bestiality, we also can't use that as a sacrifice. So here it says, I can buy an animal from a Gentile and I don't have to worry about it at all. No. Then why am I not allowed to put my animal alone in an inn with a Gentile if we're not worried that their animals engage in bestiality with their animals? So bishlam muktzah v'nevad. We get why the muktzah and nebad, I understand why we can buy an animal from a Gentile and not worry about that if I'm buying it for a sacrifice, because if they worship the animal or designate the animal for worship, there's no way they would sell it to me. Okay, they wouldn't sell it to me in general. They certainly wouldn't sell it to me if I was buying it for a sacrifice to bring to my God, right? When it's their own God, there's no way they would have sold it, so I'm not worried about that. But shouldn't we be concerned for bestiality? For this, we're going to have one answer today, and the very top of tomorrow's daf Josiah. This is why one of the reasons I tried this out was to kind of to show the flow of what we're going to do in the Gemara. Because what we're going to do right now is we're going to have one answer, and then we're going to go off on that one answer, and then we're going to do today is we're going to go off on that answer. We're going to bring an answer. We're going to have two difficulties on that answer, resolve them. And then, like a bit of a slew of difficulties, but really like two main difficulties, resolve them. Then we're going to go back and ask two small questions on the Mishna. And then we're going to come back and resolve this contradiction in two other ways. Okay, that's tomorrow. So just so you know, when we get to tomorrow, where we're going to go right back to here. Okay, you can even mark in your Gemara if you want that we're at this contradiction, and this is answer 1, and we're going to have answer 2 and 3 tomorrow. So Amar Rav Tachlifa, answer number 1, Amar Rav Tachlifa Amarava, Amar Rav Shila bar Avina, Mishmei de Rav. So Rav Tachlifa says in the name of Rav Shila bar Avina, who says in the name of Rav. Okay, and we actually saw this back on Daf Tevav. He answers by saying, Ove, so if it sounds familiar, you'll see why. Ove kochavim chas al be'emto shelo te'akel. Gentiles don't want to engage in bestiality with their own animals because they're worried the female animals will be unable to bear offspring. So, right, engaging in bestiality messes up their ability to reproduce, which is bad for the owner. And therefore, we're going to distinguish between these two cases. A Jew can buy an animal from a Gentile. Why? Because the Gentile is not going to engage in bestiality with their own animal. But if I bring my animal into an inn and put it alone in a room with the Gentile won't care what will happen to the animal, and therefore will likely engage in bestiality. And that's the first option for the resolving the contradiction. Now, so it falls a little bit short here because this says hatinach nekevot, so that relates to female animals. But scharim ma'ika lamemar. But what about male animals? You don't have to worry about. They're not going to be te'aker. Okay, it's not relevant for males. So Rav Kahana, with males, there's another problem, which is they get weaker. Okay, now we're going to see it's only when a male engaged in bestiality with the male. Okay, we're going to talk later about a female. But it seems that or a female, I think that's the issue with the female. Okay, we're going to get to that. But we'll see. This isn't necessarily all cases, but bestiality of a male with a male animal will weaken the animal. So we have an issue with the females, an issue with the males that's specifically related to, right, we're going to now distinguish. I can't put my animal alone because there'll be bestiality because the Gentile doesn't care about my animal. So even if it will weaken my animal or make the animal sterile, that's irrelevant to the Gentile. Gentile doesn't care because it's not their own animal. But when it's their own animal and I want to purchase it, I can for sure assume that it didn't engage in bestiality. Again, that's answer 1 to the contradiction. Not everybody agrees with this. We'll get to that tomorrow. So now we're going to start with our questions. Elahaditanya. But wait, there's a braita that says, Lokchim behema mero'eh shelahem. You can buy an animal from their shepherds. Okay, now, Lichush, now if you're talking about a shepherd, the shepherd does not have, they don't own their animals, they're shepherding someone else's animals. So why should I be allowed to buy an animal from them? What they mean here for the purposes of a sacrifice. Maybe their shepherd engaged in bestiality with the animals that they're shepherding because they're not their own animals. If the whole distinction is own animals, someone else's animals, well, well, they don't engage in bestiality with their owner's animals because there's a concern that they'll lose money, right? If the owner gets wind of it, then they've weakened their owner's animals and they're going to have a problem. They're not going to get paid. Okay, that sounds like a good answer, but there's enough problem with that. If you're going to say that a shepherd is not going to engage in bestiality with someone else's animals because they're getting paid for it, why does it say in a different Tanaitic source that I can't give my animal to a pagan shepherd? Why? Because maybe they'll engage in bestiality. Same problem as our Mishna. Now, if we said that they won't get involved with their owner's animals because they'll lose money when the owner realizes that they weaken their animals or made the animals sterile because they engage in bestiality, they're going to lose their salary. Well, then I should be able to give my animal to them and not worry that they're going to engage in bestiality with my animal. Again, that would be a lifnei iver issue. So they answer an interesting answer. Now we have to distinguish. And again, true or not true is good to, right? We don't know if this is a perfect answer, but when the Gemara is stuck, they come up with an answer. Today, there's a lot of these. We have two different cases. One is a shepherd who shepherds Gentile animals, and one is a shepherd who shepherds Jewish animals, okay? And we're going to basically say the shepherd who shepherds Gentile animals, we're not going to worry about it. Now, either which way, the shepherd is a Gentile. So the shepherd shepherding the Gentiles' animals is not the same as the shepherd shepherding the Jewish animals. Now we have to figure out why. So inu diyade bahadade miratite. If there's a Gentile who owns animals and gives it to a shepherd, now they know because they're also Gentile and they know they're, let's call them pagan. They're pagans and they're pagan, right? Then the shepherd is pagan. Well, again, in the society where this was common, or at least, again, we don't know what percentage, but there was somewhat a certain percentage that would engage in this. So because they know them from the inside, they know that there's a likelihood they're going to engage in bestiality, or at least a possibility. And therefore, the shepherd knows that the owner knows that this might happen. And the shepherd has to be extra careful because he's worried he's going to get caught. But Anan dilo yadinam behu. But we don't really know, or at least they think we don't know. Okay, we do know because we're in the Gemara and we know. But they think we don't know about them. And lo me'atate, they're not going to be scared because they think, oh, the Jews don't know we engage in bestiality. They don't do that. They don't think we do that. So the shepherd's going to do whatever the shepherd wants with the animals because they have no concern that we're ever going to be onto them. And Amarabba, it's just a side point. Hainu de amrei nashe michatva gala labaza ragla bechavre yada. Okay, so what does this mean? I forgot exactly the translation, but it's a second. The cheret korea v'roshem b'shayish, right? The person who sorry, you're helping me out here, but I don't see it anymore. Sec. English. Oh, I lost it. Where's the note? Okay. So the person who the letter knows it's the stylus and knows it's how it works. And ragla b'chavre yada, the one who the what do you call it, the rachil, the one who goes around talking about other people, knows their friends. In other words, what this is saying basically is that people know what they're close to. Okay, everybody knows things that they're close with, and therefore here. Okay, now thank you for your English translation. Having trouble finding that. As the stylist scores the marble, the gossipers recognize each other. Thank you. Missing that good translation. Okay, so that's how basically the stylist is very close and it's engraved in there. That's how the gossipers know their friends. And the point being, this is how the Gentiles know each other and they know exactly what they're up to, but we don't know, or at least so they think. Okay, so that's just a line that says the same kind of idea. Okay, but now we're back to question on this answer that Rav Tachlifa brought. So the first question was this whole issue of what about this other source, if the whole thing is somebody else? Well, we resolved that, okay? Somebody might engage in bestiality with someone else's animals, but there might be animals they don't, right? And that depends on whether they're shepherding Jewish animals or Gentile animals and whether they're going to be cautious or not, depending on the situation. Now they ask another question. So now they say, well, then, scharim minikevot, we shouldn't, males from females, we shouldn't be able to buy. That's male animals from females, because chashinan dilma merabi leilave. Why aren't we worried about, one second, just make sure I have this right. Right, we shouldn't be able to buy male animals from females because, again, there's a concern that the females engage in bestiality. Now, why is there a concern the females engage in bestiality? Didn't we just say that the owner wouldn't do that to their own animals? So now this goes to what I was trying to say before, which is females who engage in bestiality with animals, male animals, do not cause them to become weaker. It's only the males with the males, but not females with male animals. That doesn't cause them to weaken. So if the concern was with a female animal, the animal will be sterile. With a male animal, the animal will become weaker. That's only a man. But a female, it's not relevant for. So theoretically, according to this, right, we shouldn't be able to buy male animals from females because there might be a concern they engage in bestiality. Okay, that's the chashinan dilma merabi leilave. Maybe the women engage in bestiality with these animals because all the concerns are not relevant in that case of Rav Tachlifa, right? The concerns of Rav Tachlifa are not relevant in this situation. Now, we don't see anywhere where that's a forbidden thing. It says you can buy animals for sacrifices from any Gentile. So the answer, kevan migare ba miratita. If the woman engages in bestiality with the animal. Now, it's another interesting assumption, by the way. Even though there were, again, we have no idea how many, but there were Gentiles engaged in bestiality, they were embarrassed about it. They didn't want people to know. They did it in secret. Now, the concern here is a woman, if she engaged in bestiality with a male animal, what's going to happen? When they go on the street, the male animal is going to be going after her all the time. He'll be attracted to her, so to speak, because they already engaged in relations, he'll be after her all the time. So if a woman walks around and there's an animal tracking her wherever she goes, kind of on her, everyone's going to realize that she must have engaged in bestiality with the animal. It's going to be a very clear kind of thing. And therefore, she won't do it, and this is going to be her preventive. She won't engage in bestiality for fear that the animal's going to walk after her wherever she goes. And therefore, again, this mirata, she'll be scared, nervous, just like the shepherd was nervous that someone would be onto him. She'd be nervous that someone would be onto him, to her. Now, it's a different situation. The shepherd was worried they were going to lose their salary. The woman's just worried about being humiliated in public. Okay, if that's really true, that women are concerned and don't engage in bestiality because they're concerned that the animal will follow them to wherever they go, and that means basically we don't have to worry that a woman's engaged in bestiality with an animal, because, okay, in any situation. Well, look at this braita of Rav Yosef. It's going to be a little difficult because Hadatani Rav Yosef, Armelata lo tirabe kalba. A widow who's living by herself shouldn't have dogs in her house. Shouldn't have a dog. Velo tashre barbe rabush bizan. She shouldn't be alone with a man in an inn. Okay, it's not appropriate. She's a widow with unmarried with a man, with a Talmid Chacham, because we're worried something might happen. So Bishlama barbe rav tzniela. We understand the Talmid Chacham because if, God forbid, he did engage in relations with her, he'd be secretive about it, right? He wouldn't want anyone to know, so no one would ever know. And that's why she better avoid it, because if it happens, right, no one will ever know. Ela kalba Kevad bigariba miratata. But with a dog, what do we say? If the dog is going to follow her wherever she goes, then basically everyone's going to know. So she'll obviously not engage in bestiality with this dog because otherwise everyone will know. As opposed to with the Talmid Chacham, no one will know, but specifically someone might know. So the answer, Kevan dechishagele umtsu misra chabatra, meimer amrei nashe, hai de misra chabatra, mishum umtsa de kamasra. Now they say that. There's not the same concern as before because a dog, she feeds the dog meat. And therefore, the dog might be after her everywhere she goes because the dog is looking for meat. And the fact the dog tracks her every move isn't going to be an indicator that she engaged in bestiality with the dog. And therefore, it's not an issue. Okay? So it's true that I see someone's asking, the Jews didn't engage in bestiality, but I think what they're concerned is they don't want to create a situation where we have this woman who doesn't have anyone to engage in relations with, and she might, like Rashi says, shematit avev tarbiena aleha, and she might just have a very strong desire and have no other way to fulfill it other than with this dog, and therefore there's concern that that might happen. Again, it's unlikely, it's true. But I guess they're just saying avoid situations that might get you into trouble, even though there's a small likelihood of it. But I agree, it's a good question. Okay, so until now, we had contradiction. That was the first thing we did. We brought a contradiction between the Mishna and this braita. How can we buy their animals for sacrifice if there's concern of reveal? We resolved it the first way. Again, we'll get back to the second way tomorrow and the third way. We resolved it by Rav Tachlifa saying their own animals versus other people's animals. Then we had some difficulties. What about the ro'eh? What about the females? Okay, females with male animals. Why is that a problem? None of those issues are relevant. And within each of those questions, we had some answers, questions back and forth. That's all organized on the sheet if you want to look back. And now we're going back to the Mishnah. And that's why I also wanted to organize this because it's a little bit discombobulating. We had contradiction, Mishnah, braita, resolution. We're going to come back and resolve it in two other ways, but now we're kind of going back to the Mishnah. So now we have two questions on the Mishnah. With that, we'll finish. Nikevot etzel nikevot my time alom yachdina. What about female animals with females? Why can't they be alone? Okay, it said don't bring an animal into a pundak of Gentiles because they're chashudim l'riviyah, and we assume that means any Gentiles. But if the whole concern is they might engage in bestiality, there's no sexual act between a female and a female woman with a female animal. So why is that a problem? To which we're going to have two answers to this question. Because the goyim are found with their wives. They go to the wives of their friends. And therefore, what will happen? So imagine this woman is alone with this female animal. Comes a Gentile man to this woman to to engage in relations with her. Again, we're assuming that this happened often, or at least often enough. And then let's say he goes to this place where this woman is alone with the female animal, and he doesn't find her there. And he'll find the animal, and then he'll engage in bestiality with the animal. Option number two is could be he goes to the woman, but he might end up engaging in bestiality with the animal anyway, and not the woman. Again, this is hard to understand. Okay, there's some other statement that says that the behemoth of the Jews are more of interest to them than their women. Okay, so could be they'll be more interested in the animal. Now, why is this? Well, it comes from, now it's clear that even in the Gemara, they didn't really understand this whole ta'ava, this whole desire for bestiality, and they had to come up with some sort of explanation. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan b'sha'ah sheba nachash al chava hitil ba zuhama. This all came from the snake. Okay, when the snake, there's this what's the idea? There's a concept, or they talk about the fact that the snake engaged in relations with Chava, and he put into her this zuhama, he kind of planted in her the desire for bestiality. And from there to her children, from there, obviously we're talking here about men engaging in bestiality. We also were talking about females, but specifically we're talking about men. And that zuhama got to all these Gentiles. So the Gemara asked the obvious question: Yihach Yisrael Nami, what about the Jews? Why aren't the Jews engaged in bestiality if that's the case? To which they answer, Yisrael she'amdu al Har Sinai paskazu amatan. Ovdei kochavim shelo amdu al Har Sinai lo paskazu amatan. It all goes back. First sugya we had in the Masechet about accepting the Torah, and the acceptance of the Torah was the antidote. We saw this also in the sugya recently about how Torah is the antidote to how we're going to the whole thing. Second, maybe we didn't do it. Can't remember. I actually have been recording ahead of time, so maybe I'm confused now. But about Moshav Leitzim, and that this is the antidote to Moshav Leitzim, learning Torah. So anyway, we have all this concept that we don't have this issue because of Matan Torah. Second question on the Mishnah: Ibailu ofotmai. Is this also an issue for birds? Okay, is it just animals or also birds? Tashma. Let's learn it from here. To Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel Mishum Rabbi Chanina. Okay, we're going to have two of these, ani ra'iti, or I heard. Okay, ani ra'iti, I saw. Okay, what did I see? And again, it sounds like a crazy story. But from the crazy story, they're going to say, I guess this exists. Okay, so ani ra'iti ovei kochavim, saw a pagan, shalakach avaz min hashuk, took a duck from the shuk, a goose from the shuk, riva'ah, engaged in bestiality with it, chanka, slaughtered it, strangled it, sla'ah, roasted it, va'achla, and ate it. Okay, very pleasant. I saw an Arabian, or I think that's how we translate it, shalakach yarech min hashuk, took a thigh from the shuk, chakak ba'kedei riviyah, he made an indentation in it so that he could put in engage in relations with it, riva'ah, engage in relations, sla'ah, va'achla, roasted it and ate it. Very pleasant. Okay, so that was, let's just go back and go from the very beginning and we'll review the whole thing. Rishim ben Elazal, we had his braita about the kutim, and we had to distinguish kutim and Gentiles, and what's his reason for distinguishing. Specifically, he's more lenient actually with the Gentiles. Then we also said, by the way, it didn't say it's because of Lifnei Iver, but you have to add that as well about the person being in their fields. We had two versions of the story with Rava, where there was this partnership between the Jew and the Gentile, and they made this arrangement who was going to work on Shabbat and who wasn't. It all came up because we were talking about Arisim and how Arisut works. Here you could see that Arisut works, that each one kind of gets their own thing, and that's why they could make the arrangement, but they have to make it before, they can't make it after. What about if they didn't make any arrangement and each one just did what they did? We don't have an answer for that question. Then we went to this idea about not putting your animal alone with a Gentile in a room, plus also we had the yichud of the woman with the Gentile, and the third concern about the Gentiles actually killing people, and don't do yichud man with man because you might get murdered. And from there, which again, we said, we're not sure how much of a concern it really was, but there was obviously some sort of concern that was mentioned. Then we get to this contradiction of the animal, where it seems you can buy an animal for sacrifice, not where it engaged with bestiality. We had, like I said, one answer. We're going to come back to more answers to this next time. Your animal versus, right, the Gentile's animal versus someone else's animal. Okay, then we said, what about the shepherd? We had a question about that. What about the second question was the zcharim minikevot, right? Because maybe if a female engaged in bestiality, there's no weakening of the animal or anything else, and therefore, why is that forbidden? And then, why is that permitted when really she could have engaged in bestiality? And then we said, oh, because that was going to follow her. We had a question on that. We resolved it with the dog. Then, right, because the dog is different from an animal, because the dog gets fed by her, and that's why the animal's following her. Then we ended with these two questions on the Mishnah. One is Nikevot from Nikevot, what's the issue? And really it's the issue because a man might come visit her. And we ended with this other question, what about birds? Yes, also people engage in bestiality with birds as well, and therefore it would be a concern. And then, like I said, we're going to get back to in the beginning of tomorrow's daf to other options of resolving the contradiction. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and should have B'sorot Tovot.